For those of you who are worried that I'm going to do anything about tech, there is going to be no tech slides in my presentation tonight. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to 5 megatrends that have been going on for decades, which we are only now beginning to see the effects of. So, let's move on. Apparently, I'm supposed to give a wink to the nice girl with the slides so that the slides go forward. So if you see a really dodgy wink, it's nothing inappropriate, okay? So let's see. What I would like you to treat today's talk about is like the meerkats. These guys, they have one little meerkat that stands and takes guard over the rest of the tribe, and they look out for eagles and other things. The thing is, we live our day-to-day lives without scanning the horizon. The technology changes and the social changes and the environmental changes that we're experiencing now have been going on for decades. But because we're stuck in the rut of looking at our day-to-day lives, we don't notice them. So this is what tonight's talk is about. Next slide, please. This is what we're told to expect, right? You know, like somebody was mentioning, AJ was mentioning insurance and all this kind of thing. And, you know, we're supposed to, you know, grow up, go to school, get an education, get married, pop out a couple of kids, retire, and die. But I think what really happens is what happens on the next slide. Who relates to this? Pretty much, right? Okay, next slide, please. These are 5 megatrends that have been identified by PricewaterhouseCoopers. Now, they have done an incredible amount of research. As you can see, we're dealing with ultra-rapid urbanization of the total population of the planet. 50% of people live in cities. Think about that for a sec. Think about food supply. Think about medical. Think about the fact that the population is also aging. We have 8 billion, close to 8 billion people on the planet, but there are less children being born in every single country except for one, India. Even China is in population deficit. Then the middle class is shrinking globally. And the middle class is the engine of economic growth. So we are facing unprecedented challenges on the planet today. Plus, let's not even get into climate change. Whether you're with Donald Trump or whether you're against him doesn't matter, because the point is we, forgive the phrase, we are fucking up the planet. And it's us. It's not about CO2. It's not about anything else. It's about the fact that we have destroyed 40% of arable land in the last 50 years. 3% of the water on the surface of the planet is drinkable, and much of that is polluted. This is us. It's not about CO2 or anything else. Now, the good thing, with all of the technology that we have at our disposal, it is my personal opinion that we can solve these problems if we have the will as a community, a global community, within just 1 year. I'll come back to some more examples of that. Other things, we have technological shifts, which you're seeing about, we're talking about blockchain, and I'm going to touch on AI. Next slide, please. The world has already changed. As The Economist put it a couple of years ago, we are living in a post-factual world. We are dealing with the fact that people tweet, and that's considered truth. How many Instagram followers people have? That is the arbiter of truth today. So whether these people know anything about the subject they're talking about is an entirely different topic. So we're living in a radically different world than we were just maybe even 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. Next slide, please. To sum this phrase up, the planet will survive us. It has. It's gone through many, many extinction events in the past. We may not survive us. Next slide, please. Okay. Just click again. Okay. Who's a fan of George Bush? No, right? Just remember, this guy is a mass murderer. So, bearing in mind what he said after 9/11, which is only about 18 years ago, he did not call for an attack on everybody else initially. No, not yet. What he did, what he said, was go down to Disney World in Florida. Go and buy stuff. Why? Because the global economy is dependent on us as consumers. And that was true then. It is even more true now. We have incredible power in terms of what we buy, what we eat, and what we believe. Next slide, please. This is just from January the 1st of next year. This is just 10 years away. How many of you are surprised at some of the countries you see on that list? Obviously China, yeah, that's not a surprise. India, USA, and I think the numbers are slightly overstated for the US. Indonesia, look at Turkey, look at Brazil, Egypt, Russia, Japan, and Germany. Some of those countries you will see in another slide. Next slide, please. As I said, we're going through a massive level of urbanization. We have 1.5 million people added to cities every single week, globally. Next slide, please. What is the biggest myth ever, especially because of the urbanization, that we are disconnected from the natural environment? We absolutely depend on everything that is happening on the planet today. We would not live without a tiny little creature in the sea that is being overfished called phytoplankton. That is the basis of all life on Earth. I'll come to that in a sec. Next slide, please. Again, cities, obviously, take a huge amount of global resources. Next slide, please. 90% of world fisheries are either overfished or near fully fished. So those of you who are having your McNugget, fish McNugget or whatever you're having, that fish that you're eating looks like something out of an alien movie, because it comes from very deep sea fisheries. There's no longer surface fish anymore. And where is all the waste that we're putting into the sea going? Into exactly the same place that these creatures live. Next slide, please. This is a rather sad slide. 40% in suicide rates over the last 45 years. And of those, of the ages between 15 to 44. Why? Next slide, please. I suspect it's because of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which are not being met. We have physiological needs. We need to sleep well. We need to have good food. We need to have places that we feel safe in terms of safety, physical safety, emotional safety. Next, we have love and belonging. Then we have, can we go back a bit? Yeah. And then we have self-esteem. And then you have things like what's called self-actualization. Is your job fulfilling for you? Are you doing things that are meaningful for you to leave a legacy on the planet today? How many of you in corporate jobs feel you have meaning in your job? Show of hands. Good, there's a couple. How many of you don't? How many of you don't know? That's okay. The thing is that we're dealing with a pace of life that is so fast that we are not able to catch a breath. And that's going to get even worse in the next 10 years or so. Next slide. As Morpheus said, all I can do is show you the door. It's up to you whether you walk through it. There's a lot of material and data in the previous slides that might shock some of you. Bearing in mind that we have the technology that we, as a global population, can implement. There was an Irish teenager, only 16 years old, who has come up with a technology to remove microplastics from the ocean. There are so many technologies out there. There are untold technologies out there that are ready to deploy. Why they're not being deployed, we'll come to next. Next. Okay, and I'm not going to have a go at government in specific terms, but what is the role of government? Let's look at that for a second. It is to protect, to legislate, to enforce, to license, and above all, to tax. And above all else, to record. What does governments do? What is their time frame? Their time frame is from the next election to the next election to the next election, which is usually 5 years. Let's move on to corporates. 147 companies control 80% of public listed companies globally. This is a fact. So there's a huge conflict of time between governments and corporates, which control the global economy for now. The thing is, with companies, they go from annual return, and especially in the US, capitalism is incredibly toxic because they go from quarter to quarter to quarter. There is no way you can have profits every single quarter. It's not possible. The business cycle doesn't work that way. So this is where we have a huge conflict between governments who look at things in a very long time frame. 5 years is short for a government. They like to study things for 10, 15 years before they come up with policies, or else they make mistakes. Let's look at blockchain. How many countries have embraced blockchain? And it's usually the little tiny ones like Malta and Estonia and places we've never heard of until recently. But they've seen an opportunity to get on board of a new technology, whereas the more established economies like the US or some of the economies in Europe, Japan is a little bit of a weird one because they have embraced blockchain incredibly well. And China is halfway between. They've embraced blockchain as a technology, but they are completely against crypto as a technology. Okay? So that's one thing. Next slide. We're going to go through a huge global shift that we have not seen since 500 years past. Next. This is a chart of GDP for the last 2,000 years. Okay, if you look, it's not linear. If you look at where it says 1600 to 1700, you look at the colors of the countries that are there. Remember we talked about Egypt and Japan and all those other countries? They were part of the global economy. You look at China, you look at Japan, you look at India. And so what's happening now is the power balance that was taken from this part of the world and places like Latin America and Mexico, where I'm from. And if you have any particular racial stereotypes about Mexicans looking not like me, that's your problem. So you look at the transition that's happening from this point on, everything is going back to this region. What is produced in the West today? Debt, war, entertainment, handbags, a few good cars. What else? Big pharma, defense. If you go back maybe 25 years, 30 years, pretty much everything we would have bought would produced in the West. Lifts, clothes, etc. All of that is now produced in this part of the world. What's interesting is now factories are starting to move out of China. They're going to places like Vietnam and Bangladesh. So what happened in Malaysia when I first came here, there was kilang everywhere. Now those kilang that used to be in places like Glenmarie Industrial Estate, in Penang, and they used to be in Singapore originally, and then they moved to Malaysia, then they moved over to China. Now they're moving out of China because cost of deployment. It's too expensive in China now for some industries. Bangladesh, which used to be the poorest country in the world, is now the fastest growing economy in the world. Next slide. Then, as if that was not enough, we're going through these amazing waves of innovation. And as you can see, they're getting faster and faster and faster. Right now, if you look at the yellow-colored one, we're going through a level of innovation that is absolutely unprecedented. It is actually an even bigger transition than we went from farming to the first industrial revolution in the 1850s in Britain. We're going through a level of social shift that is unprecedented. Next slide, please. And again, this is a problem that's bigger than any government can handle. Yet there is hope. I will come to that in a bit. Next. New technology. You can look at some of the technologies we have there. We've got blockchain, which you've heard about today. You've got AI. You've got 3D printing. You can now 3D print a house and build it in 24 hours. They are 3D printing hearts. The technology we have today is absolutely unprecedented, and we haven't even touched on nanotechnology. What you see in science fiction movies is going to become a reality within the next 2 to 3 decades at most. Maybe not star travel to, warp drive or whatever, but that, you never know. You have NASA doing some incredible, interesting research on ion drives. Next slide. So I see blockchain as a great leveler. You heard from AJ some of the really good use cases for blockchain. And it's a very democratic tool. Now, democracy, well, that's a whole other topic. If you want to talk about democracy, we can chat later. Plato considered it the worst form of government, or second worst form of government, above a theocracy. Anyway, never mind. But it is very much a populist movement that we control the blockchain. It is not under the control of a big, faceless government, corporation, or special interests. The CIA has openly acknowledged the existence of the deep state. So, we'll move on from that. Next slide. As MIT says in a February white paper the economic anxiety over AI and automation is real and should not be dismissed. The University of Oxford has estimated that 40% minimum of UK jobs will disappear within the next 15 to 20 years. And they're being overly cautious, I think. Next. This might sound like doom and gloom, but there's a huge opportunity here for people who are willing to embrace new technology. Okay? 9 out of 10 businesses die. Next slide, please. Those headlines speak for themselves. How many of you have heard of Bloomberg, the financial services magazine? How many of you have read it? Okay. 60% of those articles that you read in Bloomberg are currently generated by an AI. We're already in this future. Next slide, please. These are some of the jobs that are going to be at risk or are going to be possibly replaced by AI technology as we use it today. Next slide. These are some of the things that AI is incredibly good at. It's good at knowledge representation, natural language processing, robotics, machine translation, except maybe Google Translate doesn't work so well sometimes. But that's another story. But actually, no, there's a beta version of Google Translate that uses AI, and it is flawless. The version that you and I have access to on the regular web is not that version. But I have seen people who work in the translation industry, and they are saying that what's coming down the pike is unprecedentedly good. Next slide, please. So we're going through a 5th industrial revolution. The thing is, the middle-class jobs that sustain the global economy are now under threat. If your job is procedural, you do a lot of paperwork, you do something that is systematic, it can be automated by AI. It might take a little bit of time for those technologies to reach Malaysia up to a point, but because of the pressures of the global economy to be more efficient, to lower costs, the ability of governments to forestall and hold back those changes is very, very limited. So the thing is, get ahead of the curve, start implementing those technologies in your own businesses and take advantage of where we are going to go. There's no point in doing startups for where we have been. Let's go to where we are going to be. Next. This is the big companies of Silicon Valley. Now, look at the adoption of their technologies over the main things, like cloud computing, obviously they're big on that, IoT, variable, drones and automation, AI, machine learning, reasonably okay, augmented reality, very little, blockchain, not so much. Where is all of the technical innovation coming from? Africa, Latin America, and above all, Asia. This is where innovation is coming from. Why are you all here? Next. Why am I here? Okay, this is again the internet era, mid-90s. That's when the rise of the internet came popular. Next, social media. This is with, again, Facebook, Twitter, etc. Where we are now is the collaborative economy age. And this is things like Uber, Airbnb, and a couple of other, hybrid models like Oyo. And next one, autonomous world age. What we're doing is we're transitioning to a period where governments no longer are the controlling forces in our lives. They are a big influence, yes, but they're not capable of controlling all of this because they can't. They can't create policies fast enough. Next. And this is just a short example of a couple of logos. There's about 800,000 projects of blockchain, of which some that are showing up on ICOs alone, 886,000 since 2005. The level of growth in just blockchain and AI alone is unprecedented. And this is where we save ourselves, because these projects are feeding people. You've got, what's it called? I can't remember it. Never mind, I'll tell you in a bit. There's one of the blogging platforms on the blockchain that is feeding children in Africa. Next. My last slide. What we consume, what we watch, what we eat, and above all, what we believe is the way we change the world. Because with 8 billion people on the planet, we are the engine of the global economy. That's why I say we can change the world in just a year or so, to a large extent. It depends on small, conscious choices that we do on a daily basis. It just takes a little courage to look at something different. Thank you very much for your kind attention.